Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Jay Singh, and I'm the founder of Publication Academy, your online training partner for higher ed career advancement and professional development. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today for this installment of our Career Pathway series, Exiting Academia. Today we have a fascinating interview with Dr. Beryl Rabindram, who successfully transitioned from completing a PhD in life sciences into the exciting industry vertical of big tech, specifically Amazon. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Over now to our amazing Publication Academy interviewer, Dr. Gertrude Nantra.
Well, I'm so excited to be talking with you today. Such a great honor to do that. So we're going to start by, asking you, what's your PhD in and what do you currently do?
Sure, and thanks to you for having me. It's an honor to talk to you as well. So my PhD was in life sciences / biochemistry. I studied yeast genetics and mostly focused on the cell division process, especially how cells divide and particular proteins in that process that help the cell to divide. We looked at some of what happens when you overexpress certain genes or you delete certain genes and what that does to the cell. That was really my PhD. What I'm doing right now is completely different. I am working in a tech company. I work for Amazon, for AWS specifically, as a product manager. And I think we are going to talk today about that whole journey.
Yeah, which is so interesting, right? Because you wouldn't think that somebody who is getting a PhD in the biological sciences would be doing something on their software side. Tell us more about that. Like, what was that journey like for you? Did you always want to work in tech? Did you want to work in academia but then decided to work in tech? What was that decision like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, there is no straight line. I think when I first started, when I was doing my PhD, like everyone else, I sort of thought I would go into the postdoc route after my PhD, but I always wanted to work in industry because my goal really was I wanted to see all of this cool science and technology that exists. How can it impact people? And I wanted to be a part of taking the science and the technology that we were working on in the labs, all of this cool stuff, and actually bringing it closer to people. So that was always my desire, and that was, I guess you can call it a North Star. That was always my guiding principle. So even after my PhD, even though I applied to postdocs and things like that, I was trying to see, hey, is there a way for me to sort of work in a startup maybe? I didn't know exactly what that would look like, but that's where I started. And so once I finished my PhD, of course, life happens in parallel, and I had actually given birth to my first child just 2 weeks after submitting my thesis. And so I decided to take some time to be with him as well, and in parallel start applying to jobs. I think you've talked about your process. It was hard for me as well to figure out sort of how you actually, where do your skills really fit in? And I think the moment it clicked for me was really figuring out what I liked to do during my PhD, and then matching that to, okay, what's available out there. So I figured out that I actually like talking about science more than actually doing the science. So I decided to focus on roles that allowed me to do that, and one role that would allow me to do that was the application specialist role. And so I decided to apply to those kind of roles because
Was this in application specialist roles? I know application specialists are usually in the biotech industry, but was this in biotech?
No, this was actually in a medical device company.
Oh, okay.
So I had started looking seriously at startups because I felt like I was somehow drawn to the, taking a new technology and then bringing it to market to patients. So I started looking at medical device companies, and one of the companies that I applied to had a clinical application specialist role. It was actually funny because one of the software that I'd used during my PhD called ImageJ, they were asking for that specific software as a skill, which is rare. It doesn't always happen.
Which I don't mean to interrupt you, but this is so great that you're sharing this, Beryl, because number one, you said I looked at the things that I liked to do and I like to talk about science. So I was looking for opportunities to talk about science. But also you you just mentioned something powerful. There was a software you didn't even think would be relevant, ImageJ, right? We use that within the biological sciences for visualizing proteins, right? And so now you're using ImageJ, which I hated back then personally because I never could figure it out, right? And now you're using it in the medical device company. This is amazing. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, so I was actually very intrigued by that as well. I submitted my, neatly formatted resume. By that time, I'd figured out how to do a one-page resume and not the whole CV with all of your publications. And so I submitted that one-page resume. I had, I was lucky enough to get a call back from the recruiter, and I'm still friends with her, and I keep in touch with her. And she basically said, "I really loved your resume. I had to chat with you." And so I was really happy because it took a long time for me to get to that process, about I think more than a year since I'd graduated from my PhD. And so I talked to this team. I really liked what they were doing. Basically, they were looking at how to make the breast cancer surgery process, finding out whether the patient needs to come back for a second surgery or not. How do they sort of reduce the risk of having to come back? And so they were using imaging, they were using some new devices that could help doctors sort of see if there was any cancer left in the tissue that was taken out from a patient. So I really loved what they were doing, but they were using ImageJ to look at some of these images. And so I was like, I know ImageJ and I know how to present because I've been presenting complicated things to people for the past 4 years, and I can do that for you. So that was really what they were looking for. My boss, the manager who interviewed me, she told me later that she didn't hire me because of my PhD. She hired me because I gave a good presentation. And that was the skill that they were looking for, someone who could communicate something really difficult in a clear and easy to understand manner for surgeons. And so they gave me a paper to read, and they were like, can you go look at these papers and then come up with a presentation that you would use to explain these papers to surgeons. And I did that. I cited some of their own papers, and I was like, I saw what you guys are doing here. And so they were very impressed, and they decided to offer me the role. And I had a blast really for 3+ years at this company in Toronto where I worked as an application specialist. And
I have a question for you, Beryl. Yeah. Did you feel like it was easier to get into a startup? Because you talked about startups. Did you feel that, I don't know if this is actually a question that maybe you can answer, but did you feel like it was simpler, maybe easier to get into a company that was a startup that, maybe it's not as established or well known versus trying to get into a bigger, more established company as your first job? What's your mindset around that?
Yeah, I mean, like everyone, I applied to all of the pharma companies. I applied to, the big names that you will envision yourself when you are doing your PhD. But I think it was difficult for me because I didn't have any industry background, and I didn't know at the time which of the roles in those companies I should be targeting. And so I think for a startup, it was a little bit easier because they were willing to consider my PhD experience as well. Right. And I don't know if they do that in industry, right when you're getting out. I know there are roles where you have the ability to do that, but for me, just for my own personal experience, it was a little bit easier to get those interviews with the startups compared to maybe getting an interview with an established company where I felt like they were requesting a lot more industry experience to get in.
That's really good. That's really good. And because I had a sort of a parallel experience, a similar experience in that when I work in medical communications, and when I was trying to get into medical communications, the company I started at, great company, it was a smaller company, definitely not the same amount of pay as a bigger company, but they were willing to work with some, like you said, somebody that didn't have that real world, like PhDs are real world experience, but,
I
but you know what I'm saying, right? A lot
Yeah.
of the time, companies don't see your PhD, necessarily always see your PhD as like real life
Work experience.
experience,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so because of that, this is one of the reasons why it's such a struggle for people to get into industry, because we did all these amazing things in our PhD programs, but yet it's not viewed in that light. But I agree with you that with a smaller company, with a startup, it can be easier to penetrate and like sort of cut your teeth in the industry. You were there for 3 years, and then what happened after that?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, life happens in parallel. And what happened was the pandemic hit. So I was actually at this company. What I was doing was, it was a startup, so I got to wear multiple hats. When I started as an application specialist. I went into the field. I was in the operating rooms, like standing next to surgeons, and they were taking out the tissue and giving it to me. I was scanning the tissue, gathering data for my trials. Basically, I was helping run clinical trials for the startup. And all of these trials were happening in the US. And so I was traveling every week from Canada to the US to run these clinical trials. And when the pandemic hit, I could not do that anymore. Um, what happened was I ended up taking more of like a data management role because I had to stay in Canada. And I had to train a team in the US to actually go and run the trials. That was a good experience too. But I think over the 3 years, I found that I there were some gaps in my understanding. Like there was one particular meeting I remember where they were talking about this thing called PNL, and I found myself wondering, like, what are they talking about? What's a PNL? And I had to sort of ask my husband, and he was like, well, it's just profit and loss. Like, what are you talking about? And I was like, I have a PhD. I have so much education. I don't even know what a PNL is. And so this was like an indicator to me. And some other meetings where we like talked about strategy and like high level, how do you make decisions on like what markets to enter, what things to target, and things like that I felt like I wasn't really able to contribute much to. And that helped me, together with the time I had during the pandemic, to really think about like where I was going with my career. That helped me to sort of see if an MBA should be something I should look at. And I had always wanted to study in the US as a child growing up. Like when I started getting interested in biotech, everyone was like, oh, US is the place to study for biotech. But at that time, I couldn't really get in because I didn't have the finances to really fund a master's degree in the US at that point. And so when I always used to complain to my husband, and like, if I had done my master's in the US by now, I'd be somewhere else. And my husband was like, what was stopping you? And so I was like, yeah, there's actually nothing stopping me. And so I decided to apply for the GMAT and just strict try, and it turned out that a really great school, Cornell, was willing to give me a scholarship to study in their 1-year MBA program. And so I did that for a year, just after the pandemic, 2021 to 2022. And because I had worked at this med tech company before, what happened at that company was that I saw a real shift in how we store data, how we did trials, because there was a lot of medical imaging data. We started using the cloud. We started using AWS to store our images and things like that. And so that was really my introduction to I didn't even know that AWS does healthcare and life sciences. And so that was really my introduction to that. And during my MBA, one of my seniors I was going the, traditional, I'm going to go into healthcare consulting route that people usually talk about during their MBA. But then one of my seniors suggested, hey, you should look at, you have some tech experience. You should look at tech companies. And I was like, I don't know how you would consider my med tech clinical research background as tech experience, but I guess it's okay to give it a shot. And so I just like submitted my resume to Amazon, and I was one of the like first few people invited to interview, and they gave me a job. So that was like my long, very weird
No,
journey
it's a
of getting to.
really interesting story. Like I'm
Yeah.
so intrigued now. And so what do you actually do in your current role at Amazon?
So at Amazon, I'm actually sort of like an application specialist. It's
Okay.
like it's called a product manager, but
Okay.
basically what you do is you have to really understand the technology of the team that you are managing as a product
Mm,
manager, and you have to communicate the value of that product to different people within, the team, depending on who your stakeholders are. I talk a lot to customers and I try to understand what their pain points are with the product. So because it's AWS, many products are sort of more mature, and you have to sort of figure out where our customers are having problems with the product. How can we improve the product to make it easier to solve customers' issues? And it's very similar to the application specialist role, I find, because you have to have a level of ability to like really learn very quickly, because things change a lot, and these are really, really technical products. Like this is, you wouldn't even I wouldn't even have thought when I was doing my PhD that I would be learning something like, pricing model algorithms.
right.
And I was, because I think because of my PhD and because of the ability to, like, we have to learn things quickly, I was able to pick things up very quickly when I joined the team, and really able to communicate the value in like simple terms. And I think these are skills that I found from the PhD to my first job in industry to my current job. I've been able to leverage to really add value to what I'm doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that story. So what I'm picking up, I think sometimes when these conversations around industry come up, a lot of us begin to talk about transferable skills, right? And that can be really hard to wrap your mind around. Like, how are my skills going to transfer, right? But I think, Beryl, your descriptions and your story, right, just illustrated that in a PhD you really have to learn things quickly. So we're
Hmm.
the bosses. I always say we're the bosses of learning. We're the masters of learning, right? When you go
Yeah.
into a PhD program, you do have to pick things up quickly. So I feel like that's skill number one.
Yeah.
Another skill I saw you bring up is communication, right? That's another skill that a lot of PhDs do pick up on the way, because you have to communicate your data, you have to communicate your ideas in a way
Hmm.
that makes sense, and sell your ideas, right? Like
Yes.
sales is part of it, like
Yeah.
convincing people, oh yes, like this is why you should use this software, or this is why you
Yeah.
should use this product, right? I heard you
Hmm.
bring that up. Is there any other skill that you would say? I mentioned these, but is there any other skill that you would say your PhD and maybe even your MBA? Because I feel like an
Hmm.
MBA definitely gives you business acumen. Like these two degrees gave you that you have found helpful. Because definitely P&Ls, I also didn't know what P&Ls were, but my husband is an accountant, so I found
Yeah.
out what that was.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah, I think other skills, I would say like one thing that I find day to day that helps me a lot is the writing. I think we do a lot of writing in PhD, and like writing a 600-page thesis or writing, a technical paper. We do a lot of written communication, and I think that really sharpens your thinking skills as well. Like how do you, you have a hypothesis, how do you bring in like supporting points, and how do you come to a conclusion? I think that is something that I use every day, especially at Amazon, because we write a lot here. For every meeting, we don't use presentations, we write 6 pagers or 1 pagers. So that's been very helpful. But I think like the most important thing that the PhD has given me is really the ability to persevere in the face of, failures. Like I think every PhD student or every researcher goes through this. Like you have experiments not working, you have, why is this blot not coming out right, and you have to redo the whole thing again, you have to repeat an experiment 3 times, and all of these things that we do that, train us to really persevere and keep going, to meet the end goal. I think that is probably the most important skill that we, pick up during our PhD that can really help in your career, because you're going to face that no matter where you go. Like there's going to be data points that don't add up. There's going to be things you do that maybe didn't help in the long term. And how do you deal with the failure? How do you get back up? How do you come back to work the next day and still, give it 100%? I think that is one of the biggest skills, I would say, reflecting back, that has really helped me.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, Beryl. So, as we sort of land the plane, one of the questions I want to ask you is if you had a graduate student right in front of you today and they were like, Beryl, tell me how I can be as great as you.
I don't I don't know if I'm there yet. I think we're all, on this journey, and we're all trying to figure it out. But I think the advice that I would give any graduate student is don't be afraid to try, something that intrigues you. Like if you want to do your PhD in a particular field, if that's what interests you, go for it. It doesn't have to be like you don't have to think 10 years down the line and say, oh, am I going to have a job in this field when I graduate? And I think that sometimes we do tend to overthink a lot as PhDs, as graduate students, and maybe it's okay to just, be okay with following your interests and take it one step at a time. I would say don't be afraid to if you want to go learn something new, when you're in your PhD, if you want to go to a different department and take a different course, you should try it. It's the best time to like explore and see what else is out there. I feel like there's so much happening in terms of like technology and different fields sort of merging and trying to come up with, being at the intersection of I think two fields is really something that might make you stand out. So don't be afraid to like explore different things, whether that's science and technology or anything else like humanities and technology. There are so many different options today. So I would just say don't overthink where you need to be 10 years from now and just take it one step at a time and keep following your interests.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Beryl. This has been such a great conversation. And I know that, if you're listening to this interview, it's, I'm inspired. So I hope you're inspired. Thanks so much, Beryl.
Thank you so much, Shi. Thank you for having me.